So I mean, obviously, kind of a lot of what you're saying right now holds a fair bit of optimism, but is the optimism that people there on the ground warranted? Like, is there a positive way out of this for them, and how likely is that?
Yeah, I mean, that in a way is the question. So we've seen defections by the police in 4 major cities now. So we've seen it in Patain, Naypyidaw, which is odd because it's right at the center of military power, Magway, which is a division, not a city, but I'm not exactly sure which city, and then in Machina up in the north. And the police have always been kind of like the military's little brother. And so they're not taken quite as seriously. But anytime the police defect in a situation where law and order is trying to be restored, it's a pretty big deal. And so you're also seeing a general strike by all of the ministries. So the Ministry of General Education is out. Most of the Ministry of Health is out, except for people who are emergency workers, who are trying to keep those folks, like people who are dying, alive. And so you have a sort of collapse of a lot of the institutions that would keep the state functioning. Now, the way this cuts both ways, however, is that the military doesn't really care. Right. And what I mean by that is that they're insulated from the sort of mandate of the people. They don't rely on tax revenue in order to get their money. And this is a kind of a classic rent-based state. So like a state like Saudi Arabia, that once the oil starts flowing, you don't need to listen to the people because the oil is worth so much and it costs so little to get out of the ground. Very similar for these guys. So the fact that the institutions aren't functioning is symbolically useful, but it's not going to make the military collapse necessarily. What is kind of interesting, though, is for a long time, the military has been able to kind of divide and rule with the ethnic armed organizations by picking them off one by one, by cutting deals. And one of the things that they had going for them was the idea that there was a national peace process that everyone would be cut into. The last 10 years, that hasn't gone very well, mostly because the military isn't very trustworthy. And what we see now is, the sort of puts paid to the suspicions that they weren't trustworthy. And so as a result, you have a lot more unity or potential unity than you had before. So there's always been a division between people like Aung San Suu Kyi, who are Burmans, the main majority group, and all the ethnic armed groups. They're not all armed, of course, but these are organizations of violence that represent people who sometimes are like, I don't want to be represented by you. But anyway, they're the ones with the guns, so that's kind of why they matter in the politics. So you have these groups who, they don't trust the military, but they don't trust Aung San Suu Kyi either. And so what this particular coup moment does is it throws all the cards up in the air, and they have to settle in a totally different way. And what I mean by that is that it doesn't mean that he's necessarily going to be able to forge a union with the ethnic armed organizations, but it makes it a hell of a lot more likely that she will than last week or 2 weeks ago, rather. And basically, all these armed organizations are releasing statements that say, we told you so, we knew this was a sham, now this thing is over, the peace process is over, we have to go back to square one. And that does give me some hope that the military may have overplayed its hand here. It's definitely not as strong as it thinks it is strategically. And what I'm hoping for is an internal coup where another faction in the military says, we may have misplayed things here. And Bozo, Napoleon up front here, who's famously very short, hence the Napoleon reference, has basically has misread the situation, and we need him. And so that's one of the things that you'll hear on like talking head things. Other talking heads will say that this whole coup is a sort of interpersonal conflict between Suu Kyi and the Napoleon guy, whose name is Min Online. Right. And that isn't untrue, right? People do dislike each other, and people still make choices. But if you're Min Online, the Napoleon guy, and you're responsible for this vast apparatus of violence and capital accumulation, you're not free to just make decisions on a whim, because if you do, your colleagues will hurt you and your family. And as a result, that suggests that he did, at least at that moment, operate with the backing of the rest of the generals and the people under him, but that doesn't mean he will forever. And one of the things that the activists are hoping right now is that by mobilizing a sort of general opposition to this, other generals will basically come out and say, yeah, this was a bad idea. Because the only way this can go back to where it was before is if some of the main players are drastically changed. I was thinking about how to describe it in a less abstruse academic way. And I thought about, like you have your friends and they're constantly breaking up and getting back together. And you're like, oh my God, just, break up already. This is so miserable. This is embarrassing all of us. Like no one wants to see Myanmar do that thing where it's like, democracy, coup, democracy, coup. I mean, obviously in Southeast Asia, that happens a lot. Thailand, of course, being the model. But I don't think that Suu Kyi can go back with Min Aung Hlaing still as the commander-in-chief. You know the old expression, fooled me once, shame on you, fooled me once, don't get fooled again. Okay, that's the George Bush ruining of the speech. But that's a kind of issue. I don't think she'll be able to go back. But if there's an internal coup and another general emerges and says, we're going to do things a little differently, then perhaps things can get resettled. Now, I know that's a little bit in the weeds for your podcast. And I also know that's not ideal, right? Ideally, we would want a massive people power uprising. The military realizes the error of their ways. They put the guns down and they sing, kumbaya.
Kumbaya. It's not reality.
That's not reality, but I do think that there are better realities that we can get to. Whether I think that's likely, I don't think so. Like, I honestly think that if you take the parsimonious path of the path of like the things, Occam's razor, what will most likely happen is that after a couple more days, there'll be a pretty violent crackdown, and a lot of people will probably die.
So you think the violence is almost certain in the next week?
Yeah, I do, and whether how extreme that violence is and how people respond to it, whether by doubling down or whether by, understandably going home, will determine the extent of the violence. I also think that if I'm being very pessimistic, Aung San Suu Kyi will live out the rest of her days in house arrest and will never be allowed to return to power, mostly because she hasn't played by the very narrow set of rules that the military has laid down for her, mostly along the symbolic lines of not paying them the sort of obeisance that they believe that they deserve. And she believes she's the rightful owner of the country, for better or for worse. I think that she can be very imperious. Like she can act like, I think one of the odd things about she in the military is that Freud has this idea called the narcissism of petty differences. Like you end up hating the people that you are afraid you're most like. Someone who's like totally different than you, they don't really make much sense to you. But that guy who kind of like has the same narcissisms that you have, for instance, you hate him the most, that kind of thing. I mean, we all know that being former models, that one guy who has the extra level of six pack. You're like,
yeah, I hated those guys.
What's wrong with him?
That guy. Which way are you judging? Yeah.
And so as a result, I think that they're very similar. Aung San Suu Kyi and the generals, they both believe that they should stand above the people and be the ones who get to ultimately make the decisions and ratify them. And I don't think she was ever willing to play by the rules that the military laid down. Now, that's a little bit more speculative, obviously. So there's a real interesting mixture of sort of instrumental political maneuvers here, where like about money, about violence, about who stays in jail and who doesn't. And then there's also these sort of symbolic ones about like what do the aesthetics of power look like and who gets to wield them.